Hello and welcome back to our study of the book of Mark. Today we're in Mark chapter 11, verses 12 through 25. And in our last study, we saw an anticlimactic triumphal entry. People thought that they were ushering in the Messiah, but instead Jesus just looked around the temple, saw it was late, and went home. Who was it late for? Well, I propose that it was late for the temple. Today's story is going to bear that out a little bit further as the next day Jesus gets up and goes back to the temple again. This time there's no fanfare on the journey, and Mark once again here uses a story sandwich where he places one story in between the ends of another story. And so in this case he sandwiches Jesus' encounter in the temple with an encounter with a fig tree. And so when you see a story sandwich, that tells us that we are supposed to consider these two stories together. So the story of the fig tree is supposed to help you understand what happened in the temple. And this is all connected to the idea that when Jesus had arrived at the temple, it was already late. So let's read the story and let's find out what happened. So it says in Mark 11, starting in verse 12, going through 25, "The next day, as they were leaving Bethany, Jesus was hungry. Seeing in the distance a fig tree in leaf, he went to find out if it had any fruit. When he reached it, he found nothing but leaves, because it was not the season for figs. Then he said to the tree, 'May no one ever eat fruit from you again.' And his disciples heard him say it." On reaching Jerusalem, Jesus entered the temple courts and began driving out those who were buying and selling there. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves, and would not allow anyone to carry merchandise through the temple courts. And as he taught them, he said, "Is it not written, 'My house will be called a house of prayer for all nations,' but you have made it a den of robbers." The chief priests and the teachers of the law heard this and began looking for a way to kill him, for they feared him because the whole crowd was amazed at his teaching. When evening came, Jesus and his disciples went out of the city. In the morning, as they went along, they saw the fig tree withered from the roots. Peter remembered and said to Jesus, "Rabbi, look, the fig you cursed has withered." "Have faith in God," Jesus answered. "Truly I tell you, if anyone says to this mountain, 'Go throw yourself into the sea,' and does not doubt in their heart, but believes that what they say will happen, it will be done for them. Therefore I tell you, whatever you ask for in prayer, believe that you have received it, and it will be yours. And when you stand praying, if you hold anything against anyone, forgive them, so that your Father in heaven may forgive you your sins." This passage really bothers a lot of people today, and I've heard atheists talking about this passage and how upset they are at Jesus' cursing of the fig tree. They say that Jesus didn't respect other people's property, or that Jesus was just being a whiner, and what did the tree do wrong? It wasn't the season for fruit, so why did Jesus curse it? Or, if Jesus could feed 5,000 people, why couldn't he just tell the tree to make fruit instead of cursing it? Now, certainly, this whole way of thinking all comes from a modern worldview, and it completely misses the point of the story. See, Jesus here is acting like an Old Testament prophet, acting out scenes of God's judgment. And the whole cursing of a tree actually takes us back to the book of Jonah. In Jonah, God withered a vine, and Jonah was angry about it. And God asked Jonah, why was he unhappy about a vine withering, but he didn't care about people turning to God? And so the same thing is true here. People concerned with the plant miss that the point of this passage is again about people turning their hearts towards God. So, in this case, the fig tree stands in as a representative for the temple. The fig tree is full of leaves, but it isn't producing fruit. Its time has passed. It's no longer its season. Maybe it did produce fruit before, but now it's just going on without producing fruit. It's in full leaf, The tree appears healthy and strong, but there's no fruit. And it's the same way with the temple. The temple is going strong. The priests are there. They're still offering sacrifices. But despite this, the temple has no fruit. Its time has passed. And so Jesus rebukes that tree with a word. He says, "May no one eat from you again." Jesus isn't here to reform the tree. The tree had its day. Now its time is done. It's the same way with the temple. The temple had its day, but now its day is done. So immediately when Jesus enters the temple, he starts overturning tables and chasing people out. Again, he's acting like an Old Testament prophet, making a dramatic display of God's message for the people to see. Now he makes a ruckus, but it isn't to the point where the army is going to step in and, put him down, right? But he's making this obvious scene. He's making a scene in the temple. And it says that, he was teaching as he did it. So the people who were watching, they understood that Jesus was acting prophetically. He was acting like a prophet, and that he was making a prophetic judgment against the temple and what was going on in the temple. The people understood that. And he taught them, saying, "Is my house not to be a house of prayer for all nations? But you have turned it into a den of thieves." So here's his legal indictment. This is the charge he's bringing against the temple. The point of the temple was that it would turn people from all nations towards God, and that they would come to the temple and pray to God. Instead, the temple has become corrupt. It's become self-serving, and it's like just a hideout for thieves. In other words, it's not saying that the money changers and all that were thieves, although there's kind of an implication about like turning the house of God into a market isn't encouraged, but more the sense of the priests, those who are operating the temple, are the thieves, and they act like they're doing something holy, but what they are actually doing isn't. So the temple is filled with corruption that abuses people rather than turning people to God. And those who are operating the temple are the thieves, they're ripping people off. So, of course, when he says all this, who doesn't like it? The priests and the teachers of the law. They don't like this, and they want to kill Jesus because he's prophesying against them, and they know it. And we're going to see in the next passages, again, he's going to prophesy against them. And so he's calling it into the system that they use to aggrandize themselves and to make themselves rich, rather than serving people and calling the nations back to God. So the next morning, they're back out by the fig tree, and Peter notices that the fig tree has withered. Jesus' curse had power, but Jesus' curse against the temple had power too. Just like the fig tree withered and died, so the temple withered and died. And in fact, we're going to see the temple veil rip later on in the book of Mark. And so there's this whole kind of indictment against the temple. And we know historically that in 70 AD, the Romans destroyed the temple, and it has never existed since. And so this happened during the lifetime of many of the disciples and the people who were there and heard Jesus say this. They saw it happen. So he cursed the fig tree withered. He has put his curse on the temple, and the temple withered and died. And the time of the temple was over after 70 AD. And there still is no temple in Jerusalem, just one of the walls. And in fact, Muslims have control over the main Temple Mount area, not Jews or not Christians. So what are we to make of this? The temple and everything about it was part of the old covenant. But Jesus is bringing a new covenant. But for the new covenant to take hold, the old covenant must be ended. You see, the old covenant had all the law, right? All of the law was connected to the Old Testament, or the Old Covenant. All the laws of Moses, the Ten Commandments, all of it has to do with the Old Covenant. And there's some people who say that all of those laws still stand. But the thing is the Old Covenant also involved animal sacrifices. And God ended that practice in 70 AD. So clearly the Old Testament has been ended by God, because you can't have the law without the sacrifices. You can't have half the covenant. No, it's the whole covenant, the Old Covenant. And the sacrificial part has been done away with since 70 AD. So the Old Covenant was made obsolete. But this happened so that Jesus could bring in the New Covenant. You cannot have both. The Old Covenant had its time, but now under it, it wasn't bringing people's hearts to God. That time is over. Jesus brings in something better. He is the house of prayer for all nations, and you don't have to be at the temple in Jerusalem. And that's where we get to the conclusion of this passage. Because Jesus concludes this section talking about the power of true prayer and faith. And we might find it strange that he goes off on this tangent about throwing a mountain into the sea. But think about it. What did he say in the temple? He said, my house is to be a house of prayer for all nations. And he ends this section talking about prayer. And so he's bringing them back to this. The temple was supposed to be about prayer. It's not. But I'm going to tell you something. Prayer in faith is the true prayer. And he connects it to the temple again when he says, I tell you, you could say in faith to pray that this mountain would be thrown into the sea. This mountain is a specific mountain. The Temple Mount is the specific mount. So he's not talking about, you can have these like force powers like Darth Vader and throw a mountain into the sea. No, he's saying that in faith you can tear down that mountain of the old covenant and throw it into the sea. This mountain, the Temple Mount. So, real prayer offered in faith is what the temple lacked. And in prayer and faith, you throw that old system into the sea and you come into a better way where there's real authority in the prayer. So he's talking about, again, the difference between the old and the new covenant. In the new covenant, it's about faith. It's not about the temple and the sacrifice. It's about faith in Jesus Christ. And with faith, you can pray truly effective prayers. You don't need the temple for effective prayer. You need faith. You don't need the temple system of sacrifice for forgiveness of sins. Instead, you offer God true prayer in faith, worshiping in spirit and in truth, and in forgiving others. You receive God's forgiveness of sins, something that wasn't happening under the temple system. So we see how the fig tree and Jesus chasing people out of the temple work together here. I hope this message has been a blessing to you. God bless you. I will see you next time.